Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing okay. Today I'm bringing you my reading journal update for January and February of 2026. As usual, it's late, but I had kind of a weird beginning of the year reading wise. In January I read 7 books, but there were 7 books from the same series. So I was reading them quite quickly because I was engrossed into the story and I didn't want to stop to make spreads, and I found a solution for that you will see in the rest of the video. And in February I only read 1 book and my spreads weren't ready until March, and it felt silly to have a video about 7 books from the same series, just 1 in February, and I just got into my own head. I promised myself when I started doing reading journal videos that it wouldn't what's the word? I can't find the word I want to say, but I promised myself basically that it wouldn't change the way I read. And it's been on my mind quite a bit since January that I need to read more of different things so the spreads are interesting and the videos are interesting. So it's a bit of a work in progress right now. But the cover spread for January and February is very simple as usual. I have my cover spread for 2026 on the left. I set it up in my reading journal setup that I will link down below. And I mixed January and February together because there were a lot of covers for January and not for February, and I didn't want to have an unbalanced layout. So I read 7 novels in January, a few albums and graphic novels in February, plus 1 novel I had started in January and finished in February. And that's a novel I didn't think I was going to read. It's Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, and I have thoughts, let's say. I have never really shared reading stats, numbers of books read in my reading journal videos because that's not something I care about, and if someone should care about my numbers, it should be me and no one else, so I don't really see the necessity of sharing them because reading isn't about numbers, it's about what you get out of it, the enjoyment, the learning, the escapism, so that's why I never really mention numbers. So in January I read volume 8 to 14 of the October Day series by Shannon McGuire. I've talked about it in other videos and I'm not going to summarize volume 8 to 14 because that would be a lot of spoilers, but I will present the story after I talk about my spreads. I had a lot to say about those books and I wanted to do spreads that would have multiple volumes. As I was reading the books in January, I used what I called my quick reading journal. It's a notebook I've made to be able just to jot down ideas about books when I don't want to be doing elaborate spreads. That's more or less the way I used to reading journal before I did those more creative spreads, and that's one way I had been reading journaling for so many years because it's so effortless. So when I end up writing my reviews, I will be copying down from the notebook, and I wasn't sure how much space I would need, so I didn't really write down which volumes I was going to talk about in that spread. I wanted a very simple and open spread. I remember when I did my first spread for the series, I had also done a flap and I had been really happy about it, except I had not made it as balanced as I could. It was a bit too busy, so this time around I was very mindful of that, and it might look a bit boring if you're used to layouts with more stuff, but that's how I like them. I wanted some illustrations to help with my spread, but it's so hard to find illustration from this series, and I did not fancy wading through AI slop to find something I would enjoy. And as I was thinking of what I would like to have on those spreads, I thought of Tony DiTerlizzi, who co-wrote and illustrated the Spiderwick Chronicles, and his illustrations fit so perfectly the universe of Toby Day that I looked for some of his pictures. I printed them on sticker paper and had my cutting machine cut around them like stickers, and I think they are perfect. And that's basically all the decoration that's going to be on the spread. I used some washi tape as a background for the stickers. I think I was reminded of this trick when I watched a recent Erin Smith video, because I really wanted to have something more than the stickers, but I wasn't sure that if the washi tape would be too much. But this washi tape from Journal Say with this scribbling on it is one I love so much as a background because it is unobtrusive, it doesn't have a heavy visual weight, and I just love it. And in fact, I finished the roll I was currently using at the beginning of the video, so that was exciting. And don't worry, I have 2 backup rolls of that tapes. By the way, if you know of a smaller creator that has a similar tape, I would love to purchase this one instead of the Journal Say tape in the future. The last thing I did on the spread was add a quote on the right, and I made sure to leave enough space around it because that was one of the things I didn't like about my spread last time. I had also printed a title for the spread in the same color range as the illustrations. I will do that off camera, but I end up removing that and reprinting it exactly the same way because I had moved the title after I had stuck it down. It didn't look as neat and I kept looking back to it every time I was browsing through my books, so that's what I did. And one of the tricks I have when I do flaps like that is to use a pencil to trace where the flap stops so I don't write too close to it for comfort. Finally, I used my usual Pelikan fountain pen. It's a €5 fountain pen. I use a converter with some Pelikan ink, and that's it. The Toby Day universe is urban fantasy. Toby Day is a changeling. In this universe, a changeling is not a baby fairy switched up with a human baby. It's a person that has a fairy parent and a human parent. That makes them kind of an outcast in the fairy realms because they're not seen as pure enough and they're not immortal, so the immortal fairies don't value their lives and usually use them as cheap labor. They also don't have any laws protecting them, so that's not a great situation to be in. In the first volume of the series, Toby Day is a private detective. She's following someone that ends up transforming her into a fish, and she is stuck in that fish form for 14 years. And when she comes back to her human form, her family has moved on, her daughter has grown up without her, and she can't go back to her family because she hasn't changed, because changelings live longer lives than humans. So she ends up being a private detective again and taking on investigations mixing human and fairy crimes. That's basically all I can say, and if that sounds interesting, I won't say the series is perfect because I remember when I was reading the first and second volume being quite, not infuriated, but I could see the solution to the plot in like the first few chapters, and sometimes you're really surprised because you didn't see the motivations for the criminal, so you're still surprised in the end. But this was infuriating and that was a bit of a downer, but despite that, I think the first time I started the series I read 5 or 6 volumes, so I still enjoyed the universe immensely. I love novels that weave classic fairy tales with modern life and that plays on creatures you find in poems and tales and novels, and Shannon Maguire does it beautifully, honestly. There's a lot of downfalls to that series, but this she's really good at. And when I started the series again, I found this lush universe again, and it was so interesting. But when I mentioned that in volume 1 and 2 it was so easy to see the solution of the mystery from the first few chapters, that was not the case for the other volumes I read, except it came back I think in volume 12. That's what reminded me of it, because I had completely forgotten that had been a problem for me when I was reading the series, so that wasn't great. But this time around, the stuff that was super obvious wasn't the whole plot, it was just one aspect of it, so I was less aggravated by it, I guess. I enjoyed those 7 volumes, some more than others, because as a lot of urban fantasy series, the author spends so much time summarizing what's happened in other volumes, because I think the thing is to have a reader being able to pick any volume and not be lost, and maybe imagining that not everyone remembers everything, which is fair, but sometimes they summarize the same thing over and over in the same book, and it's like, why don't you just write a summary at the beginning of the book instead of weaving it into the narration, because it's quite tedious. I ended up being able to fit 3 volumes in that spread, by the way, so I'm gonna need another spread for the other 4 volumes. However, there's one thing that really makes reading those books quite uncomfortable and annoying, is that the book is set in the US and it's all about fairy tales and mystical creatures and how the little people and fairies are living besides us, and that fairies are everywhere and I've always been there. But it's set in the US and it never, ever mentions indigenous people. And I understand that you might feel uncomfortable talking about indigenous stories. You might not be a person that's knowledgeable enough, and you might just want to avoid a pitfall by not talking about it, which is what I read in an interview by Shannon McGuire. If I remember correctly, she said this wasn't her purview, and because she didn't feel comfortable and qualified to do it, she just opted for not mentioning it at all. But like not mentioning that colonization existed, not mentioning that indigenous people existed, which is, I understand a fantasy novel is not a history book, but if you set your story in the US and you keep talking about immigration, but you don't mention colonization, it's just so uncomfortable because you're erasing how your country was born and how those creatures from Gaelic folklore arrived in the US. It's just a plain erasure of it all. I'm just disappointed. I'm doing the last spread, and if you've noticed, I did more than one flap. I did 2 flaps because I have 4 volumes to talk about in this one. I used other Tony Detelitz's illustrations for this spread, and these ones I had to cut around myself because my cutting machine would not recognize the cutting marks on the paper. And for this one, I innovated by adding some fern stickers under the fairy stickers because I think it adds a nice contrast with the title, that I decided to print in a different font and a different color, because as much as I loved the previous spread, it felt a bit too one-tone with the green titles and the green illustrations. It was a lot of writing this time around, so I'm gonna let you enjoy a bit of it with some music. In February, I was lucky enough to be able to read 3 volumes of the Asterix graphic novel. I read the last 2 newest volume and an older volume, and I was able to read them in French, which is a treat. I don't want to read them in English. I'm sure the translations is well thought of, but I don't. Nothing beats the French text and the puns and the names of the characters. If you don't know about Asterix, it's a classic French and Belgium sort of graphic novel. It's about this little village during the Roman conquest of Gaul, that's now France, and how they're always resisting to the invaders. The main characters are Asterix and Obélix, and I wrote that the title of the series was Asterix et Obélix, Asterix and Obélix, because that's always what we referred to the series as when I was growing up, and I was sure that was the title of the series, but I realized in February of 2026 that the title is only Asterix. So I just decided to keep the title I grew up with because I'm a rebel. As the years went on, I wasn't a fan of the new volumes of the series because they're not written by the original authors because they've passed on, and I think as a matter of principle I didn't want to read them, but I would buy them for my dad's birthdays and Christmases because all the volumes of the series I read over the years were from his own childhood collection. And at some point I started reading them and I didn't like all the new volumes, but some of them I did. And case in point, the first volume I read was L'Iris Blanc, The White Iris, and it's also translated into English. And I just loved it. It was such a fun plot and it's always such a pleasure to go back to Asterix and Obelix. But one thing I noticed when I was reading the volumes this time around, the newest ones, with the authors taking the series on, seems to be trying to put so many pawns per little squares. It's like they're trying to max out the pawns, and it sometimes feels like they're having a quota. They need to put as many pawns as possible. And when I reread volume 20, Asterix in Corsica, I noticed that wasn't the case there, which I thought might be it. And it was much more resting and it was such a nice experience. For the spread, I found a font that looked like the one on the covers of the graphic novels. I printed a bit of illustration from Asterix in Lusitania to add to my spread, plus a little cutout of Asterix and Obelix to add to the spread, and that's it. I had enough to say for a full spread because I had read 3 volumes. Initially, I had thought of doing a 1-page spread, but I realized that I would have to cram a lot on 1 page, and I didn't want to do that. So the book I had started in January and finished in February was Throne of Glass, the first volume of the series by Sarah J. Maas, and I'm not sure why I read it. I read it the first time 12 years ago now, and I did not look it up before I read the volume, but I had given it 1 star on Goodreads, and I remember I had not enjoyed it, but I didn't know I had given it 1 star because I'm very parsimonious with my ratings, but a 1-star one is quite very infrequent, let's say. But I kept watching those reading journal videos and I kept seeing people borrowing the series at the library, being so happy about it. So I'm like, am I missing something? Am I just being snobby? So I started reading the first volume and I immediately remembered why I had not enjoyed it. Honestly, when I see people borrowing those books from the library and being so excited because they haven't read in a long time or they're just enjoying the series so much, and seeing them recommending it to their friends and seeing people who haven't read in a long time borrowing it and just feeling happy. When I see this whole community online talking about those books and reading and branching out to other books, I think it's so sweet, and clearly this series is not for me and I would not recommend it, honestly, but I don't see why I should be mean about it. It's just not for me. The way I was able to read the series was I started reading it during my little breaks at work, so that was like 15 minutes every few days. So I would read for like half an hour a week. And this way it was quite fun because it was like watching a telenovela. It was outrageous. It was not reasonable. It was full of plot holes and drama and angst, but it was fun to read during my breaks. And that's why I ended up reading volume 2 because I was curious to see where it would go. What's funny is that in the first few chapters, I was like, okay, so that's the big secret, that's the big reveal about her identity. This time around, I could see everything coming from so far away, and if you've never heard of the plot of Throne of Glass, it's about this assassin, and I'm going to pronounce her name the way I've pronounced it in my head for 12 years, because if you want me to pronounce it one way, don't put the pronunciation guide at the end of the volume, because I'm never going to see it before I start reading. So we have this assassin called Selina. She's been sent to a labor camp, and she's been there for a year. Suddenly, the crown prince of the kingdom comes looking for her because he wants her to participate in this competition where she would be put against other assassins and criminals to become the king's champion. And that means killing for the crown and other stuff like that. So from the beginning, Selina is touted as the baddest, bestest, most wonderfulest assassin in the whole kingdom, in the whole world. She's only 18, but she's done it all. She's been an assassin since she was 12. She studied with the king of assassins, and yeah, let's say Sarah J. Maas doesn't mince her words. And she's the bestest assassin in the whole world, but in the first chapter, so she's been in labor camp for a year, she's been starved, beaten. She sees this pampered crown prince and this captain of the guards, and what she thinks is that they're sexy. She is, in my opinion, a complete brat, and that's a bit of character development for sure. An assassin that loves fineries and that loves to buy clothes and that loves to eat sweets. That's not bad world building or character development, but the bratty side is so annoying to me. She's just complaining for every single thing, which could be an act and could be interesting, except she seems to have 2 brain cells. She doesn't understand why she needs to use strategy to win the contest, even though winning the contest would mean winning her freedom. She resents having to hide her identity, she resents to have to follow rules, but at the same time, she discovers that she's able to flee and no one could stop her, but she decides to stay in the castle in the most evilest of kingdom to serve the most evilest of king because she doesn't want people to think badly of her for fleeing. Even though after serving her time as champion, she would be free, and what she wants to do is flee after that. So I'm just like, that doesn't make sense. I know she has to say for plot reasons, but it's so silly. And her shallowness is just, every time there's something remotely courageous to do, she doesn't want to do it, but she still ends up doing it. So it's just, she complains about the court being so cruel and so callous, and at that point in the book, hundreds of people have been massacred by the evil king's army, and they put on a ball, and even though she's disgusted by the court, she still thinks that it's so romantic to have a ball, and she's so mad to not be invited, and you're like, there's no consistency in her character. She's supposed to be so good, but we never see her actually killing anyone in this volume. And I know there's no place in the plot for it, but it's like, if you present me with the bestest assassin in the whole wide world after she's been captured, why don't you have a prologue when you show her killing people, so we establish her credentials as the best assassin? Because in this volume we don't see any of her fine qualities, and every time she does anything remotely not related to put fine dresses on, the captain of the guard is like, oh, she was so competent and she was so good, and you're like, are we looking at the same person? And obviously there's a love triangle and there's a lot of angst, and I just skipped those passages because I couldn't see the attraction, and it really felt like watching a telenovela because they share a kiss and it's as if they've had this whole history between them. I thought I would see why people love this series so much, but honestly, I couldn't really, because I could see it when I was reading Fourth Wing, because despite the stuff I didn't like, it was a big book, but I flew through it because it was so interesting and the world building was fun and there were dragons. But in this one, it feels so unbalanced and uneven that I don't get how Sarah J. Maas attracted such a wide readership. Despite all of that, I read volume 2 and I just kept asking myself, why do I want to read it? I think it was the habit in a way, because it took me a month and a half to read the first volume because I was reading so little every week. And it became a habit to have it during my breaks. I could completely detach from work when I was reading, and it was so silly. I didn't have to take anything seriously. I just wanted to continue the fun and the aggravation, I guess, because it was such an exercise, and let's not take anything seriously because my brain was so tired of some of the nonsense I was reading. It's just, I will summarize by saying I'm happy that people have found joy in reading this series and reading this author, but this is not for me. So I didn't talk about the spread at all as I was doing it. I did a spread for volume 1 and 2 because I read volume 1 and 2 together without stopping to write a review. My thoughts about volume 1 and 2 were mixed together, and I didn't want to try to detangle them for the spread. It is a very simple spread because I had no idea how to decorate it. Usually I would have gone for fantasy and sparkles and stuff, but I didn't want to. I use simple stickers with these little scrolls in black and white because they looked like fantasy enough for me, and I wrote down the title and cut each letter in blue initially to go with the cover of the first book, but I didn't like how the blue clashed with the black and white stickers I had, so I went over the letters in black and I preferred it. Now I'm going to finish the video with finishing the spread about the latest picture books I read. I had done this spread at the end of 2025, but I had enough space for 3 more albums, so I just added them here. I read The Sandwich Swap and the 2 new volumes of the Night Owl series, Night Owl and Early Bird and Night Owl's Little Christmas. I don't have a lot to say about The Sandwich Swap. It was sweet but not super novel or incredible. I had loved the first volume of the Night Owl series. It's just a little owl that wants to be a knight, and the illustrations are cute, the message is adorable, and I was so looking forward to read the next volumes. They were as cute as the first one, but I was a bit disappointed by one aspect of the story, but I don't want to spoil anyone, so if you have any kids in your life, the Night Owl series is awesome. And even if you don't have any kids in your life, if you like graphic novels, for me, picture books, I like mini graphic novels and I so enjoy reading them. And here it is. I hope watching me doing these very simple spreads wasn't too boring and that you didn't mind I didn't have a big variety of books this time around. Thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye!